morning, I would encourage you to open up into Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24. There is a note left for me on the pulpit that is a visual description of what I'm going to be talking about this morning. I don't know how that happened, but it's very fortuitous. So whoever you are, thank you. And also I'm a little weirded out that you're a psychic, but that's a completely different story. Luke chapter 24 is where we're going to be this morning. We're going to discuss a story that I think is really important, doesn't nearly get as much attention as it should. If it does, it's usually overlooked, usually talked about in a different format. The story of the road to Emmaus to me is one of my favorite gospel stories because it's so isolated. It's kind of just by itself. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. As I look out, I see that we have a very full crowd. We have a lot of people here that are traveling. We have some people here that have moved to the area. And so whatever reason you're here this morning, I want you to know how much I appreciate it. I want you to know that you are our honored guest. We would love to get to know you. We will give you a socially distant high five at the end of services if you'll let us. But we would love to get to know you and talk to you a little bit more and see where you're from, see if we can make some association in some way. But as I also know, as I look out this morning, that a lot of people here may be here for the first time, or maybe here for the first time in a long time. Because I know that all throughout the world, really, people are gathered into church buildings primarily to hear a story in particular. They're here this morning to hear a story about Jesus' resurrection. And for a long time, I used to kind of shy away from that. You know, if people are going to be coming in droves to services, you want to hit them with something hard. You want to talk about first principle stuff. You want to talk about baptism. You want to talk about something that's foundational. And then I realized, it hit me like a sack of bricks, you don't get much more foundational than talking about the resurrection of Christ. And so if you are here this morning, you hear about the resurrection of Christ, congrats, you will hear that this morning. But if you are here this morning, hear more about the gospel, we would love to talk to you about that as well. That's our goal here today. And I know that as you look throughout a lot of churches, there's a lot of topics that you can talk about when you discuss the story of the resurrection. You can talk about the women that met him at the tomb. I think that's a great story. You can talk about the empty tomb itself, how it's a metaphor. You can talk about the prophecies that lead up to the resurrection. You can talk about Jesus eating breakfast with Peter by the seashore. There's a whole lot of stories that you can kind of pull from. But there's one story that's found here in Luke chapter 24, the road to Emmaus that I just mentioned, that kind of seems to stand by itself. And that's not because the other gospels don't talk about it. As a matter of fact, one gospel addresses it very briefly, kind of in passing, but it just seems to be so unique for so many different reasons. The story of the road to Emmaus, for starters, begins with two completely unknown characters, which is unusual when you look at these Bible stories. Usually when you talk about this great miracle or the Sermon on the Mount, all these different things, you have bit players in the background that you recognize from other stories. You've seen this guy pop up in other instances. This guy just happened to be somebody who's listening to it and now reappears here. But you don't really have that with the road to Emmaus. You have essentially two completely unknown characters, one of whom is named Cleopas, but you have two completely unknown characters that are walking along from the road to Emmaus from Jerusalem that are just kind of talking about what happened. And I think that's a really interesting viewpoint. It's almost as if you have a on-the-ground reporter, field reporter, that is analyzing the situation that's happened recently in Jerusalem, and they're just kind of making notes. They're just kind of talking shop. It's very similar to what I would imagine you or I would talk about when we discuss politics or when we discuss current news. You know, that ship that went sideways in the Suez Canal. Let's talk about that. And so it almost seems so objective. It almost just seems like such an observer standpoint that these two people just kind of seem to be completely oblivious to the fact that the world literally just shook from underneath them a day or two earlier. And then you also have Jesus that shows up on the scene and intentionally almost just kind of comes in as a third party. He talks about himself from a third party standpoint. He kind of is there oblivious to the fact that he's even there. And as he's talking with them about the different events, he just kind of engages with them, assuming that they don't know that he is, because they don't know who he is. Which is not, by the way, a unique instance with just this story. If you remember when Jesus, or when the women go to the tomb and Mary is crying at the open tomb and Jesus comes behind her and comforts her and talks to her, she doesn't realize that he's standing there. She thinks that he is the gardener. And so it almost seems as if Jesus gets some kind of, it's almost intentional that he is withholding people from understanding who he is at this point in time. But this conversation paves the way for what I can only imagine at least a 2 or 3 hour discussion about the events that took place in Jerusalem. But think what you also see in the story is the fact that there is just so much joy at the end of it. You can't talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ without talking about hope. You can't talk about the resurrection without talking about themes such as grace and faith and love and the fact that we, ladies and gentlemen, do not have to die forever, that there is a resurrection. And when you look at a lot of the sermons throughout the book of Acts, when you look at a lot of the themes contained within the epistles, you see this idea popping up over and over again. Make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, that when the Gospels or when the apostles preached the gospel to the people, the resurrection was the focal point of their conversation. They would talk about different things. They would touch on the Jewish relationship. They would talk about the Pharisees. They would talk about Scripture. They would talk about miracles. But they almost always, and I'm saying almost always, talked about the resurrection. Now, coincidentally, that's also the time where a lot of Greeks kind of turned away from that. But there's a very obvious reason for that, ladies and gentlemen. The resurrection of Jesus Christ brings us so much joy. And one of the things you see in this passage is these people that are going on along their way towards Emmaus, and knowing that it is late, they ask Jesus to stay with them. It's late. You can't go back on the road. And then when they do realize that it's Jesus who's talking to them, they run 7 miles in the dark to go talk to the apostles about it. You don't do that, ladies and gentlemen, unless you are consumed by joy, unless you are just overly emotional. And so what you see happening in this story is an objective viewpoint where people are talking about the goings-on of Jerusalem, they're talking about the crucifixion, talking about the Messiah, talking about the Pharisees, talking about all these different things, but then at the end of the story, it completely turns around. And that objective viewpoint that they had just hours earlier now is transitioned into 100% emotion. I want to read this story. Luke chapter 24, starting in verse 14. Actually, verse 13. Luke chapter 24 and verse 13. If you don't have a Bible, I would encourage you to just listen because it's a beautiful passage either way. And behold, verse 13, 2 of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things which had taken place. And while they were talking, discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you were exchanging with one another as you were walking?" And they stood still looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days?" Jesus knew what had happened better than anybody. He said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified them. But we were hoping," notice there that kind of second person, we were hoping that it was the third day, we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. And indeed, besides all this, it's the third day since these things happened. But also some women among us amazed us. When they were at the tomb early in the morning, didn't find his body, they came, seeing that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the woman had said, but him they didn't see. And he said to them, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary," verse 26, "for the Christ," notice he's still talking about himself in third person, "was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" And then beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them all the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And as they approached the village where they were going, and he acted as though he were going further, they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is getting towards evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed it, and brake it. He gave it to them. And their eyes, verse 31, were opened. They recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, verse 32, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road and while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" And they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem and found gathered together the 11 and those who were with them, saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." And they began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. The story, ladies and gentlemen, is just fantastic. Because as we talked about, it takes somebody from a completely objective viewpoint all the way, ladies and gentlemen, to somebody who was 100% invested in the gospel truth. But what I find amazing about this scenario is that none of the other gospel writers talk about this, at least in detail. Mark does one half of a verse we'll mention a little bit later, but nobody else ever really talks about this. But Luke, who is somebody, as he mentions there in the first few chapters of the book of Luke, and also in the first few chapters of the book of Acts, sets out at the beginning to write a story. I want to verify all these accounts. I want to verify these things that I hear so that you, O great Theophilus, as he mentions in Luke chapter 1, have an accurate understanding of the events that took place. And so it makes complete sense that even though the rest of the apostles, the rest of the Gospels would completely ignore this scenario for their own reasons, Luke describes it. And not only touches on it, but touches on it in extreme detail, down to the conversations that they are talking about. Let me tell you why this story matters. And this may be things that you've heard other places, but I hope that we can kind of bring some new information to you. This story matters, ladies and gentlemen, because there are more witnesses to the resurrection now. It's hard to imagine ourselves in the shoes of the apostles during this weird 2.5-day stretch that's taking place here. If you can imagine that you're one of the apostles, you're not Peter, you're not John, you weren't in the Garden of Gethsemane, or maybe you were, but you weren't anywhere near there, you're just kind of there, and you know in the upper room Jesus had talked about crucifixion, you heard about the soldiers taking Jesus to the cross, you're observing these things from a distance. What do you do on Saturday? What do you do at breakfast time when you're sitting around with the other apostles and you're discussing the events that took place and how everybody else scattered? We know what they did. They gathered inside of an upper room and they shut the doors because they were afraid that other people might know who they were. And they were afraid that they might find them. But I think what you see in that upper room scene where all the apostles are gathered together is a unique sense of community. They're the only people in the world that have gone through what they're going through. They're the only people in the world that knows what it's like to have that close of an association with Jesus. And so now we have to discover on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday what we're going to do about this. Because we saw miracles. We heard his teaching. Some of us saw him transfigured. But what are we going to do about this? The fact that there are more witnesses to the resurrection doesn't just buttress the faith of others, but I would argue it reinforces the faith that those people had. There seems to be a weird sense of disbelief that's happening amongst the apostles here, and I don't think it's all inherently evil. I don't think when we talk about the disbelief that takes place amongst the apostles in this little 2-3 day stretch, that it's all necessarily sinful. If you were put in their situation, you wouldn't want to believe it either until you saw with your own eyes because of what the implications would mean for your life going out. And yet you have the two women that go to the tomb, and they see an empty tomb, and one of the angels explicitly says, "Tell Peter that Jesus has risen." And so you take off. And by the way, in Mark's gospel account, when Peter and John run to the tomb, it is very explicit that Peter beat John to the tomb. I like how he just kind of slides in that little nugget there. But they don't see Jesus. And then they come back. And in Mark chapter 16 and verse 13, there's this passing reference to how two people on the road to Emmaus said that they talked to Jesus, and then they told the apostles, and the apostles didn't believe them. So it seems like there's this weird kind of sense of disbelief that's taking place amongst the apostles. But now you have, ladies and gentlemen, ironclad proof from these people that there is a resurrection. And if you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that's the exact point that Paul is making here. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, this opening few verses, he talks about the value of the resurrection. Because there was this belief that was going around with a lot of people that Jesus hadn't risen, that we're not going to rise. So Paul just addresses it head on. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 1, he says, "Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which you also received, in which also you stand, by which also you are saved." And those are 3 points that he's going to make in the next 50 verses in sequence. You are saved if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you had believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then he appeared to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at the time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he also appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. For I am the least of the apostles, not fit to even be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me did not prove vain, but I labored even more than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. The reason for this scenario, ladies and gentlemen, is very simple. Paul talks about how these people have this idea that the resurrection isn't taking place, that Jesus has already come, the resurrection maybe even didn't happen in the first place, which I think is a direct combat against this Gnostic belief or disbelief in a bodily resurrection. But regardless, the point he's making here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first 11 verses is if you don't believe me, go ask this nearly 1,000-strong group of people that did see him. But did you notice what Paul did at the end? Paul doesn't just say, go ask these 500 people, go ask Cephas, don't go ask James, go ask these people. He doesn't just say that. He then says, you should ask a sworn enemy of God, myself. If you want to know somebody who has absolutely no skin in the game, who has everything to gain by Jesus still being dead and absolutely nothing to gain by him being alive, it's me. As one who was born out of season, somebody who persecuted the church of God. But thanks be to God that his grace reached even me. You have Cleopas, who many people assume that if somebody is named like that, that's completely random, that the early disciples most likely knew him. And so if Cleopas, who they can go and talk to him by name, saw this resurrection, they can go ask him. They can ask James. They can also ask Paul, who had nothing to gain by the resurrection. I affirm to you, Paul says, that he was risen, or that he is risen. I would tell you also that it shows the path from doubt to faith. We've talked about it a couple times so far, but I want to reiterate the fact that this journey is just so absolutely remarkable. Because these people who move from this objective position of talking about the situation now move into a position where they're completely overjoyed by the events that have taken place. Now we believe. Now we understand. Now we see it. And it's a path, ladies and gentlemen, that every single person, no matter where you are in your life, can take at this exact moment. When you look back in Luke chapter 24 at that initial speech that they gave to Jesus, they talk about a few things. They talk about how there was a man named Jesus from Galilee who did remarkable things. They talk about the fact that he died. They talk about the fact that there have been maybe a few people that saw him, but they didn't really see any evidence about it, which leaves us a little bit confused. And so here's the million-dollar question. If you're on the road to Emmaus, if you're one of these two people, and these are the facts as you know them, not just from the last 3 days, but also from your experience hearing about Jesus of Nazareth, what's the debate about? Because objectively speaking, what happened, happened. What took place in Jerusalem took place. Jesus is dead, crucified, in the tomb. We know that. Where's the discussion? The discussion, as any logical person would make of it, is, what do we do with this information? This guy claimed to be somebody great. We knew that he was great. We believed that he would be somebody great, but now he's dead. And we don't know what to do with it. And at that moment, Jesus arrives on the scene. And if you notice, what he mentions in Luke chapter 24 is he begins speaking to them all the prophecies concerning himself. Jesus takes these guys on a path, beginning with all of the scriptures that take place in the Old Testament concerning the Messiah, all 300 some odd prophecies probably. I don't know. But he takes them on a journey that talks about the Messiah. And he explains to them every step of the way that all of these things needed to take place. But there's still the question lingering in their mind, isn't there? If this Jesus of Nazareth certainly fulfilled all of these prophecies, if he certainly did all these amazing things, and he dots every one of these I's, if he checks every single box, the fact remains, ladies and gentlemen, that he's still dead. What do you do with that information? He disappears, and then he's completely gone. And it's at that point that they realize, as they talk about there in Luke chapter 24, that the Messiah that they heard about, the Messiah that was explaining these things to them, that Messiah is not dead, he's risen. And it even mentions in their minds, it says, were our hearts not burning within us when he explained these things? The truth was there. We knew it was truth, but we just couldn't believe in it. Because after all, the tomb is still there. Have you ever had those moments? Have you ever had those moments where you are faced with truth, where you are faced with something you know you need to be doing, you know what the right course of action is, and you feel it inside of your bones, not in a supernatural sense, but just in a very real emotional sense. You know what you need to do, but there's just that little bit of hang-up there. It's the same hang-up that the apostles had. We know, we saw, we were there, but he's still dead. All of a sudden he's alive. That was a horrible snap. All of a sudden he's alive. And now all of those prophecies, all those things that we assumed were there, now they're continued. when that little bit of hesitancy goes out and that little bit of hang-up kind of goes away, all of a sudden you're allowed to give yourself fully over to what you know is the truth. And you're allowed to run 7 miles in the dark through a robber-infested area, through a place that is very hilly. You could slip and break an ankle in 5 seconds, but they run 7 miles in the dark, ladies and gentlemen, because they have to tell somebody. That's the transformation that takes place. That goes from doubt to faith. We see it, we know it, there's that little hang-up, it's gone, now we know. In Acts chapter 13, you see it's happening on a much longer scale, if you will. Acts chapter 13, starting in verse 26. Paul would have a lot of these types of sermons happening in the book of Acts. But look in Acts chapter 13, starting in verse 26. Acts chapter 13, starting in verse 26. Paul says, "Brethren, sons of Abraham's family, and those among you who fear God, to us this message of the salvation has been sent. For those who live in Jerusalem, the rulers, recognizing neither him nor the utterances of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, fulfilled these by condemning him." Now make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, who he's talking to. Paul is talking to Jews. You can see that in the first few verses. Verse 28, "And though they found no ground for putting him to death, they then asked Pilate that he would be executed. And when they had carried out all that was written concerning him, they then took him down from the cross, laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead. And for many days he appeared to those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, the very ones who are now his witnesses to the people. We preach to you," verse 32, "the good news of the promise made to the fathers, that God has fulfilled that promise to our children in that he raised up Jesus, as it is also written in the second psalm, 'You are my son, and today I have begotten you.' As for the fact that he raised him from the dead, no longer to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, 'I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David.' Therefore he also says in another psalm, 'You will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay.' For David," verse 36, "after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay. But he whom God raised up did not undergo decay. Therefore, let it be known to you, brethren, that through him forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And through him, everyone who believes is freed from all things from which you cannot be freed through the law of Moses." It almost seems as Paul is talking, and as these sermons go in the book of Acts that are addressed specifically to Jews, it almost seems as if there's this underlying tension there, where the Jews are listening to the guy that's speaking, and they're hearing him, and they're saying to themselves, "We understand the prophecies, we understand the Psalms, we understand what took place, but we don't really know what to do with it. And after all, Jesus is dead and his body is in the tomb." And then Paul shows up here in Acts chapter 13 and lays it completely out, not just talking about how the prophecies impact Jesus, but most importantly speak of the resurrected Jesus. And yet still people refuse it. And then Paul here in this passage talks about the fact that he is now going to be talking about it to everybody. In verse 40, he says, "Therefore take heed, so that the things spoken of in the prophets may not come upon you. Behold, you scoffers, and marvel. Perish, for I am accomplishing a work in your days, a work which you will never believe, though someone should even describe it to you." And as Paul and Barnabas were going out, the people kept begging that these things might be spoken to them the next Sabbath. Now, when the meeting of the synagogue had broken up, many of the Jews and the God-fearing proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, were urging them to continue in the grace of God. We sometimes pay lip service to the fact, and I've said it, hopefully a few times at least in sermons, that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the single most important miracle that Jesus ever did. And you see it contained within these passages. Because regardless of what Jesus did, walking on the water, multiplying loaves and fishes, no matter how many prophecies he fulfilled, all of them are null and void if there's still a body in that tomb. The tomb is empty. And that's why you have people having such amazing faith that almost just seems spontaneous and emotional, is because there's that little hang-up. But the prophecy about not undergoing decay didn't apply to David. It applied to Jesus. And understanding that, they can now put their whole heart and their whole faith towards God. I love this story also, finally, because it sheds light on the truth. At the very beginning of this story, in Luke chapter 24, verse 25, after Jesus interacts with these people on the road to Emmaus, and he hears what they have to say, they say, well, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. The very first thing that Jesus says is something that's very similar to what Jesus said in the boat when the apostles were scared for their lives. He said, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken." And beginning from that point, he then moves forward through Scripture to talk about how everything needs to take place. Ladies and gentlemen, if that's not an argument for scriptural authority, I don't know what is. Because Jesus talks about all these prophecies, all these verses that talk about him. And yet, even in churches where people are listening to God, even in hearts where people claim to be Christians, and even in myself sometimes, we still pay lip service to Scripture without really realizing the importance, and most importantly, putting the value of it in our everyday life. In Mark, the 12th chapter, Mark chapter 12. This is it's a parallel account to something that happens in the book of Matthew. But in Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 24, Jesus is talking to a group of religious leaders that should have known better than anybody else what the Scriptures talked about concerning the Messiah. And in Mark the 12th chapter, starting in verse 24, actually it starts up in verse 18, we're going to pick up in verse 24, this discussion about the most unlucky woman that's ever walked the face of the earth. 5 husbands who were all brothers, they all die one at a time. Horrible story. But in verse 24, Jesus said to them, "Is this not the reason that you are mistaken, that you do not understand the Scriptures or the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor they're given in marriage, but are the angels in heaven." Are like the angels in heaven. But regarding the fact that the dead rise again, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the burning bush, how God spoke to them saying, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are greatly mistaken." I chose Mark's account specifically because he put that little caveat on the end where he said, "You are greatly mistaken." He's talking to people here, ladies and gentlemen, who made their livelihood reading Scriptures. And somehow they had completely forgotten about the fact that in the burning bush, God says, "I am not the God of the dead, I am the God of the living." They can miss that. And yet we can miss that too, can't we? Even if you're sitting here this morning in the same pew that you've sat in, metaphorically speaking, for 50 plus years, there are still occasions, hopefully often, where we go throughout Scripture, we see something, we see it in a little bit different light, and it impacts us. That's what truth does, ladies and gentlemen. That's why these people here in this passage said our hearts were burning within us, because we know the truth. And it shines the light on what the truth should be doing in our lives. As I talked about this morning, I understand full well that there may be somebody here that I'm talking to that is here with family or with somebody else, and this may be the first time they're hearing the resurrection. That's great. Nothing wrong with that. Here's what I do ask of you. Don't let this be the last time that you hear about Jesus. If this is the first time you're hearing about Jesus, and this is the first time you're going through the story of the road to Emmaus or the resurrection or the conversations about baptism or obedience, don't let it be the last time. I would love to talk to you about the Scriptures. And everybody that you see in here this morning, despite what the news meeting, the statistics show that say that religion is declining in America, every single person in this room would love to help you. We talk about people of like precious faith. We talk about a community. We talk about fellowship. This is it, ladies and gentlemen. The bond that we have with one another. We would love to help you. Just make it known as we stand and as we sing.